multitude of the invaders. They were marched to various parts of the southern counties, quartered in deserted villages. A part were sent back to their own island, while the season of winter so far revived our energy, that the passes of the country were defended, and any increase of numbers prohibited. On this occasion, Adrian and Idris met after a separation of nearly a year. Adrian had been occupied in fulfilling a laborious and painful task. He had been familiar with every species of human misery, and had for ever found his powers inadequate, his aid of small avail. Yet the purpose of his soul, his energy and ardent resolution, prevented any reaction of sorrow. He seemed born anew, and virtue more potent than Median alchemy endued him with health and strength. Idris hardly recognized the fragile being, whose form had seemed to bend even to the summer breeze, in the energetic man whose very excess of sensibility rendered him more capable of fulfilling his station of pilot in storm-tossed England. It was not thus with Idris. She was uncomplaining, but the very soul of fear had taken its seat in her heart. She had grown thin and pale, her eyes filled with involuntary tears, her voice was broken and low. She tried to throw a veil over the change which she knew her brother must observe in her, but the effort was ineffectual, and when alone with him, with a burst of irrepressible grief, she gave vent to her apprehensions and sorrow. She described in vivid terms the ceaseless care that with still renewing hunger ate into her soul. She compared this gnawing, sleepless expectation of evil to the vulture that fed on the heart of Prometheus. Under the influence of this eternal excitement, and of the interminable struggles she endured to combat and conceal it, she felt, she said, as if all the wheels and springs of the animal machine worked at double rate, and were fast consuming themselves. Sleep was not sleep, for her waking thoughts, bridled by some remains of reason, and by the sight of her children happy and in health, were then transformed to wild dreams. All her terrors were realized, all her fears received their dread fulfilment. To this state there was no hope, no alleviation, unless the grave should quickly receive its destined prey, and she be permitted to die, before she experienced 1,000 living deaths in the loss of those she loved. Fearing to give me pain, she hid as best she could the excess of her wretchedness, but meeting thus her brother after a long absence, she could not restrain the expression of her woe, but with all the vividness of imagination with which misery is always replete, she poured out the emotions of her heart to her beloved and sympathizing Adrian. Her present visit to London tended to augment her state of inquietude, by shewing in its utmost extent the ravages occasioned by pestilence. It hardly preserved the appearance of an inhabited city. Grass sprung up thick in the streets, the squares were weed-grown, the houses were shut up, while silence and loneliness characterized the busiest parts of the town. Yet in the midst of desolation, Adrian had preserved order, and each one continued to live according to law and custom, human institutions thus surviving as it were divine ones. And while the decree of population was abrogated, property continued sacred. It was a melancholy reflection, and in spite of the diminution of evil produced, it struck on the heart as a wretched mockery. All idea of resort for pleasure, of theatres and festivals had passed away. "Next summer," said Adrian as we parted on our return to Windsor, "will decide the fate of the human race. I shall not pause in my exertions until that time, but if plague revives with the coming year, all contest with her must cease, and our only occupation be the choice of a grave." I must not forget one incident that occurred during this visit to London. The visits of Merivale to Windsor, before frequent, had suddenly ceased. At this time, where but a hair's line separated the living from the dead, I feared that our friend had become a victim to the all-embracing evil. On this occasion I went, dreading the worst, to his dwelling, to see if I could be of any service to those of his family who might have survived. The house was deserted, and had been one of those assigned to the invading strangers quartered in London. I saw his astronomical instruments put to strange uses, his globes defaced, his papers covered with abstruse calculations destroyed. The neighbours could tell me little, till I lighted on a poor woman who acted as nurse in these perilous times. She told me that all the family were dead, except Merivale himself, who had gone mad. Mad, she called it, Yet on questioning her further, it appeared that he was possessed only by the delirium of excessive grief. This old man, tottering on the edge of the grave, and prolonging his prospect through millions of calculated years, this visionary who had not seen starvation in the wasted forms of his wife and children, or plague in the horrible sights and sounds that surrounded him, this astronomer apparently dead on earth, and living only in the motion of the spheres, loved his family with unapparent but intense affection. Through long habit they had become a part of himself. His want of worldly knowledge, his absence of mind and infant guilelessness, made him utterly dependent on them. It was not till one of them died that he perceived their danger. One by one they were carried off by pestilence, and his wife, his helpmate and supporter, more necessary to him than his own limbs and frame, which had hardly been taught the lesson of self-preservation, the kind companion whose voice always spoke peace to him, closed her eyes in death. The old man felt the system of universal nature, which he had so long studied and adored, slide from under him, and he stood among the dead, and lifted his voice in curses. No wonder that the attendant should interpret as frenzy the harrowing maledictions of the grief-struck old man. I had commenced my search late in the day, a November day, that closed in early with pattering rain and melancholy wind. As I turned from the door, I saw Merrival, or rather the shadow of Merrival, attenuated and wild, pass me, and sit on the steps of his home. The breeze scattered the grey locks on his temples. The rain drenched his uncovered head. He sat hiding his face in his withered hands. I pressed his shoulder to awaken his attention, but he did not alter his position. "Merrival," I said, "it is long since we've seen you. You must return to Windsor with me. Lady Idris desires to see you. You will not refuse her request. Come home with me." He replied in a hollow voice, "Why deceive a helpless old man? Why talk hypocritically to one half-crazed? Windsor's not my home. My true home I have found, the home that the Creator has prepared for me." His accent of bitter scorn thrilled me. "Do not tempt me to speak," he continued. "My words would scare you. In an universe of cowards I dare think. Among the churchyard tombs, among the victims of his merciless tyranny, I dare reproach the supreme evil. How can he punish me? Let him bare his arm and transfix me with lightning. This is also one of his attributes." And the old man laughed. He rose, and I followed him through the rain to a neighbouring churchyard. He threw himself on the wet earth. "Here they are," he cried, "beautiful creatures, breathing, speaking, loving creatures. She who by day and night cherished the age-worn lover of her youth. They parts of my flesh, my children. Here they are. Call them, scream their names through the night. They will not answer." He clung to the little heaps that mark the graves. "I ask but one thing. I do not fear his hell, for I have it here. I do not desire his heaven. Let me but die and be laid beside them. Let me but, when I lie dead, feel my flesh as it moulders mingle with theirs. Promise," and he raised himself painfully and seized my arm, "promise to bury me with them." "So God help me and mine as I promise," I replied. "On one condition, return with me to Windsor." "To Windsor!" he cried with a shriek. "Never! From this place I never go. My bones, my flesh, I myself are already buried here, and what you see of me is corrupted clay like them. I will lie here, and cling here till rain and hail and lightning and storm ruining on me make me one in substance with them below." In a few words I must conclude this tragedy. I was obliged to leave London, and Adrian undertook to watch over him. The task was soon fulfilled. Age, grief, and inclement weather all united to hush his sorrows, and bring repose to his heart, whose beats were agony. He died embracing the sod which was piled above his breast, when he was placed beside the beings whom he regretted with such wild despair. I returned to Windsor at the wish of Idris, who seemed to think that there was greater safety for her children at that spot, and because, once having taken on me the guardianship of the district, I would not desert it while an inhabitant survived. I went also to act in conformity with Adrian's plan.